I am the past president of the Royal Economic Society, and it's my pleasure to be opening this afternoon the RES Presents on Brexit, UK and Ireland. What economic challenges face Ireland and how can economists solve them? It's extremely timely to have this. And this seminar has been in a long time coming. So I'd like, first of all, before I even start, thank you for attending and your interest. And secondly, to say that this has been organised jointly with Queen's University in Belfast. And thank you very much to our chair, Graham, for all the work he's done, with the Irish Economics Association. And thank you again to Anne Nolan and all that she's done. And finally, a thank you to the RES and to Georgina Jenkins. So given that, the way the day is going to go is I'm going to introduce our incredibly distinguished and thoughtful panelist. And then Graham, as an expert in this area, is going to take over the chairing and we'll run through some housekeeping and how the chairing goes. So it's my pleasure really to introduce the very distinguished panel that we've got this afternoon. First up will be Dr. Martina Lawless, who's a research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin. And before joining the ESRI, she received a doctorate from Trinity and works as a research economist at the Central Bank of Ireland. Her research, which is extremely well known, has focused primarily on firm level dynamics and decision making. And covers a range of topics, and she's also done some incredibly interesting work recently on COVID as well. So our second panelist, whom we hope will be able to join us, is Dr. Esmond Burney from the Ulster University Business School. He's a senior economist there. He was previously PwC's chief economist for Northern Ireland and Scotland, and prior to that, a special advisor for the Northern Ireland Employment and Learning Minister and a member of the NI Assembly. He's also a senior lecturer at Queen's as well. Our third speaker is Professor Ken Saylor of the University of Limerick, where he's an associate professor. He's also a senior fellow at the Melbourne School of Government in Australia and a research associate of the Rhodes Centre for International Finance at Brown University. And he specializes in national accounting data and using of that to make models, and also the economics of small open economies, and finally health system research. And finally, we are lucky to be joined by Stuart Anderson from the CBI in Northern Ireland, where he's the senior policy advisor to the CBI in Northern Ireland, which speaks on behalf of nearly 200,000 businesses across the UK. He's a qualified lawyer. He joined the CBI in 2019 after 10 years with a leading commercial law firms in both Belfast and Dublin. So I think you'll all agree with me that we have the most fantastic panel to discuss this issue. And I don't want to take up any more of your time except to now hand over to Graham as chair, and Graham is a senior lecturer in Queen's Management School. Graham, over to you.
Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you very much to the Royal Economic Society and the Irish Economics Association for making this event possible along with Queen's. As Carol said, the format will be each of the, I hope, 4 speakers will have 10 minutes to set up some introductory comments of their respective points of view. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up to Q&A. Now, the Q&A function, I think, is what's to be used. So if you could put your questions there, short and sweet questions, that'd be great. And I'll read them out to the panelists. We'll try and get different perspectives. Then what we'll do is we'll go after about hopefully the 40 minutes rather than 30 minutes. Then we'll have, after those questions, I'll ask people to sum up and conclude that way. And another thing to do, I have to say, is Georgina, maybe the slide with the Royal Economic Society Code of Conduct for questions to the Royal Economic Society. I'm not going to read the whole set of slides. You get the idea. The point in the Royal Economic Society is that we want to have inclusive discussions, and so we want to treat everybody as we would expect to be treated. The other aspect to remind you of is we're recording this event, and in a couple of days' time, I think that you'll probably get the video. So without further ado, I'll let Martina set up for her 10-minute introductory comments. I don't know if you have any slides, Martina, or is it just yourself?
I'm breaking with economist tradition and not having any slides.
That's okay. That's the choice I always take. So I'm afraid I'm non-traditional in that way. So non-traditional, dare we say, heterodox approach. But I'll let the floor is yours, Martina. And it's good to see Esmond's here. Okay, so take it away.
Perfect. Thanks very much for the introduction. Thanks to everybody involved in organising this afternoon's event. It's a pleasure to be part of the panel, which has, I think, a really wide scope of topics for discussion. I think actually this might be one of the few events where the change of date forced by COVID probably has given us a lot more to discuss. If we'd gone ahead on schedule this time last year, we'd have been very distracted by the range of scenarios that everybody was discussing on what might happen with the EU-UK trade negotiations. Whereas now we have a discussion where we have a trade agreement in place, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and that agreement have been in operation, working or not working, depending on where you're sitting, for a couple of months. And I think we can kind of have a very interesting discussion on where the problems that have arisen from that are, as well as, I hope, getting to touch on some broader topics of challenges that are very much common to all of the economies. And there's a wide range of issues on kind of productivity and digitalization, recovering from COVID, and dealing with kind of climate adaptation that I think there are big roles for economists to play a part in. That said, I'm going to stick with kind of opening on Brexit and talking a little bit about how that has gone in the first few months. And I think in terms of all of the discussion of how, in particular, the Northern Ireland Protocol is operating in the first months of the year, I think it's really important to start with the point that the protocol and the constraints that it's imposing, particularly on goods coming in from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, to put that in the context of the structure of the overall trade agreement. When that was agreed, and it really obviously went down to the wire in December, which gave firms very little time to get their systems in place and to understand what kind of new documentation and processes they were going to have to deal with across basically all of Europe, all of the UK, and probably Northern Ireland, obviously, in particular. The initial reaction to that trade agreement was very much one of relief. We'd been spending, as I said, if we'd had this conversation this time last year, we'd have probably spent quite a lot of time on concerns about the cliff edge scenario of no trade deal being put in place, and the possibility that trade between the UK and EU could be subject to really severe tariff barriers and all of the disruptions that will put in place. So there was an initial kind of big sigh of relief that worst case scenario had been involved or been avoided. But then aside from that kind of positive news that there wouldn't be any tariffs, I think what kind of wasn't initially clear until the first weeks of operation of the EU trade agreement was how very limited in scope it was, and how that has affected all trade between the EU and the UK, but also specifically the operation of the protocol that has Northern Ireland apply these same rules on goods as entering from Great Britain as apply in the rest of the EU. And it's because of the way that the protocol builds on the trade agreement. So when we're talking a little bit about where the protocol is not working, I think it's very important to think about where it is that the trade agreement was very narrow in scope, and some of the elements where the overall agreement that applies to all UK EU trade maybe kind of what didn't go as far as many people would have hoped that it would. And the two specific areas where the trade agreement really introduced, I think, surprisingly strong restrictions on trade or the first issue, which is very much the one causing problems for food importers in Northern Ireland, which is the extensive rules on product standards. And these are obviously especially stringent when it comes to agricultural and food products. And the second major set of restrictions, which maybe were more notable in Ireland in the first months of the protocol, were the narrow definition of what goods were judged as originating in the EU or UK, and how kind of that's important in terms of whether or not they are subject to tariffs. And there's a few anomalies that kind of were thrown off very quickly in terms of that. There was the famous Percy Pig sweets problem, which emerged from the way origin was defined, whereby minimal processing that would happen, say in the UK, such as repackaging or splitting of bulk loads, which is very common for goods in the retail market coming into Ireland from other parts of the EU, but going through a UK distributor or through a UK wholesaler, began to be treated as though they were not coming either from the EU or the UK, because they kind of fell between, they weren't transiting, but they weren't being processed there. So that was a kind of a big anomaly that affected lots of kind of retail trade. The other big anomaly then is in terms of how goods entering the EU or UK from other countries are treated, where both have a trade agreement. So the high profile example here is flour coming into Ireland from the UK, but that's using Canadian wheat, is potentially subject to tariffs or restrictions, even though both the UK and the EU have almost identical trade agreements with Canada. And that's again because the very narrow definition being used of what qualifies as an originating product. And I wanted to highlight these elements of the trade agreement, because there are areas where these are not necessarily the automatic sort of default clauses in how an international trade agreement work. These are actually, it's a particularly narrow trade agreement. And I think that's what's causing a lot of the issues, both for bilateral, overall UK-EU trade, but also specifically for issues with Northern Ireland. There's many areas where international and EU trade agreements have recognition of veterinary and regulatory standards, obviously to varying degrees of depth, but that is not a strange or unusual feature to have in a trade agreement. And there's also elements where this idea of kind of origin can be accumulated over multiple trade agreements, and that will kind of sort out the issue that's currently being faced by kind of importers of products that use inputs from other countries. So that element whereby the trade agreement kind of went down to the wire, but also that it's kind of quite narrow in scope, I think is very important in terms of thinking about the overall picture of how it's working, and where there's elements where the Northern Ireland Protocol isn't working because of issues specific to Northern Ireland, or versus issues where just the trade agreement as a whole has some big gaps in it. And the early indications, obviously, people have probably been following this quite clearly, shows that these restrictions that have been brought in as part of the UK exiting the EU have shown very sharp falls in the imports from Great Britain to Ireland, and I guess into the EU generally. There's a very striking element of asymmetry in that import and those trade figures, where exports from Ireland have fallen by much less than imports. And so there's a bit of an asymmetry in how the trade agreement and checks are being applied at the moment. On the other hand, and it was one of the discussions when people were wondering about how should Northern Ireland be treated post-Brexit, and should there be an all-island backstop? What were the trade-offs that needed to be made in terms of if goods needed to be checked, where do they need to be checked? And an argument was put forward, and maybe many people will disagree with this, that there was perhaps an opportunity here for Northern Ireland to have access to two very large trading blocks. And obviously, we can discuss the issues that this is causing for goods coming into Northern Ireland. But we have also seen that exports from Northern Ireland, particularly to Ireland, have grown really substantially in the first quarter of this year. So there's possibly some early evidence that there is opportunity there for Northern Ireland in terms of its kind of unique access to both markets. In terms of Ireland, obviously as I said, the kind of disruption and the great major fall in trade has been mainly on the import side, whereas on the export side, the full customs controls aren't really being implemented by the UK government as yet, and there's some delays been put in place there until the second half of this year. So I think, again, from a maybe Irish perspective, there's a little bit of a health warning here that things have gone quite smoothly for exporting firms in the first couple of months of the year, and there haven't been the checks that they were anticipating, but that there's still some risks that these documentation and checks get ramped up later in the year, and that the full impact of Brexit on Irish exporters and EU exporters as a whole haven't really been seen yet. And the area of research that kind of I've often generally focused on is very much on kind of what does this mean for small and medium enterprises in particular. And these are really important in terms of, across the island, cross-border trade is very much concentrated in small firms that are making kind of very frequent, but perhaps often low value kind of transactions over and back across the border, and really much more like firms operating in a local domestic market than kind of global exporters. And that's where, again, the kind of customs procedures as they're set up, they're often on the assumption that this is kind of large firms bringing like an entire 40 foot container of one individual product in and out of a market, whereas all the procedures are per consignment. But that means all the costs really fall kind of disproportionately on smaller firms, because they're more likely to be shipping small amounts or combining loads of different types of product. Whereas you've got larger firms that are exporting kind of just one product, bulk loads. It's a much smaller kind of cost to them to have one set of documentation for the entire load. And that's where on the kind of like, some of the longer term impacts to be thought of in terms of the impact of Brexit on firms trading is this idea that, a lot of Irish firms started their international trading experience by kind of starting to sell into the UK as the nearest neighbour, the most accessible market, the most familiar market in terms of obviously language and kind of lots of links going back a long way. And the extent to which this could be a kind of a bit of a barrier for firms really in the longer term, the access to kind of the first stepping stone market to broader international activities is kind of restricted or reduced, that could have kind of longer term implications to the kind of the growth profile of Irish firms. So that's my kind of initial, I don't know, hopefully discussion prompting thoughts on the various issues of the day.
I'm on muted now. Zoom. Anyway, thanks, Martina. Just remind people to put in the questions, the Q&A function. And we had our introductions by Carol, so I don't need to introduce Esmond. I'm going to say it's good to see you, Esmond. We didn't know whether you were going to be in or not, due to the joys of Zoom technology here anyway. So if you want to start with your sort of 10-minute starting ideas. That's great.
Okay, thank you very much, Graham. Thank you, Chair, and thank you everybody for giving me this opportunity to speak about these important things. So 10 minutes, I'll try and address, I think, 5 themes. First of all, what happened to the economies, the 3 economies, NI, Great Britain, Republic of Ireland during 2020. Well, clearly in Northern Ireland, we had a big slump in GDP. My colleagues at Ulster University suggest it may be about 10.4%. That is worse than the UK's decline in GDP of 9.8%. Now, the official statistics show the Republic of Ireland had something of a stellar growth performance last year because it grew. It grew by 3.4% in terms of GDP. There are technical statistical issues. The Intellectual property payments, leasing of aircraft, all interacting with the corporation tax system, which we may, of course, talk about later, given the Biden minimum world taxation, corporate taxation standards. There is also a difference in the way that the UK statistical authorities, ONS, treat government output, and they therefore may have shown a more realistic sense of decline in hospital activity, non-COVID activity, obviously, and indeed schools during the lockdown, whereas most OECD economies, including Ireland, used an employment-based measure of public sector output. But I think it is safe to say that on balance, even allowing for all statistical quirks and differences, the Republic of Ireland had a lesser decline in GDP than Northern Ireland and indeed rest UK. So second theme, what about this year and indeed 2022, the recovery? It's going to be very rapid in all three economies, almost certainly. According to EY forecasts, this year we could be looking at 6.8% UK growth. It might actually be higher. Some forecasters suggest that. Northern Ireland 5.9%. Republic of Ireland about 5% GDP growth. Now, interestingly, it looks like Northern Ireland may lag the UK. It will be substantial growth, though it's something of a rebound factor from a very steep decline. Why might it lag a bit? Structure of the economy, we've got a larger percentage of output in non-food retail, which has obviously been hit by, and there will be a legacy effect of the shift to online shopping. Aerospace manufacturing, more significant here than in GB. That's going to lag as well, because it will be a number of years before business travel, aviation recovers to 2019 levels. And perhaps there is some influence from the protocol over and above general Brexit, over and above supply chain disruption generally across the world, but we'll come back to that maybe. Third theme, what about the long term? Because this month, according to many historians, has been treated as the centenary of the creation of the state of Northern Ireland, given the implementation of partition in 1921. Well, I think in a sense to evaluate the performance of the Northern Ireland economy and indeed the impact on Northern Ireland society, we should probably go back to the founding father of economics, Adam Smith, because he said basically at the Wealth of Nations, look at the number of people, look at how rich they are. Now, over the last century, the good news is that Northern Ireland's population is growing considerably. If you put it in this context, up by 50% from 1.25 million to 1.9 million. And indeed, GDP per person has grown more than sixfold, even allowing for the very bad recession last year. And in fact, Northern Ireland's economic growth rate was probably slightly better, not much, but slightly better than the UK average. But in a sense, the glass is also half empty when you compare to so many Western or former communist bloc economies or former non-industrialized economies. They have caught up and overtaken Northern Ireland over the last 100 years. And I don't think the often used argument that we've got some uniquely favorable quality of life entirely compensates for that. I think you can argue that some of the countries that overhauled Northern Ireland on many indicators have better quality performance too, as well as GDP. Fourth theme, what do we do about this situation? And I think very importantly, we have to put out of our minds the sense that there's one sort of magic cure-all policy lever. In terms of improving public sector policy performance and private sector performance, it's often the challenge of doing a lot of small things right, and that's the cumulative effect. What I would say is that the Northern Ireland Executive needs to forefront improving economic competitiveness, particularly in terms of productivity. So whereas the draft programme for government, the sort of plan for the Northern Ireland Executive, which was there in 2016 prior to the 3 years of Stormont's non-operation, it had no target for productivity. I think one should be forefronted in there. And then a last theme, a fifth theme is, of course, to say something about the protocol. Now, what we do know is that I think Martina alluded to this, the flow of goods every year from Great Britain to Northern Ireland is very considerable. Most up to date, NISRA, or Northern Ireland Statistical Agency, figures for 2018, so it's a bit out of date, but it's the best figure we have. £10.4 billion per annum. That's about 4 times the scale of the flow from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland, which was 2.4 billion at that time. Now, of course, the key thing is how big is the cost or the frictional impediment or problem that the protocol is now creating. We don't have definitive statistics on this as of yet, but I've looked at 2 sources. Marks and Spencer's published their annual accounts end of last month, and they obviously operate in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And they reported that Brexit costs in terms of bringing in food and clothing and other material products from Great Britain to the island, north and south, amounted to about 30 million. Now, using industry-wide statistics and certain assumptions, that would suggest that the cost, the upgrade in costs on the materials, the products being brought from GB was about 6% upgrade in costs. Now, obviously, there are lots of things happening at the world level. We know about the oil price going up, you know, about construction materials going up and commodities and food going up. But this would be over and above sort of the worldwide United States, UK, whatever inflation pressures. And indeed, a second source sort of confirms to me that that 6% figure could be plausible. The BBC, 1st of April of this year, that's on their website, an article called Counting the Cost of Brexit, quoted figures from a Northern Ireland haulage firm, which again could suggest an upgrade in costs of up to 6%. Now, if you apply 6% to the 10.4 billion, that's an increase in costs every year of 600 million. Now, as economists, we need to also think about the additional public spending which the protocol is requiring, because there is, as we economists say, an opportunity cost. That's money that can't now be spent on schools, hospitals, potholes and roads, whatever. Now, the cost each year at the moment is at least 125 million. That's made up of 100 million being spent by the UK, London government, on the Trader Support Service to give advice to firms to fill in the verbs, like the country of origin verbs that Martina referred to there in her introduction. There's also the £25 million per annum that the Northern Ireland Agriculture Department is spending on vet services to apply the huge increase in the number of vet food animal SPS, so-called checks at Belfast Port, Larne, Warrenpoint, Derryport, etc., etc. And that figure, of course, could escalate when the grace periods end and meat products and dairy products as a whole start to have to be checked. So you add that all up, you're talking about 700 million plus with the possibility of increase. Now, of course, there's a benefit side to the equation as well. Martina, again, referred to this. We know from the Irish Statistics Agency, CSO figures, and I've looked at the figures for the first quarter of this year compared to last year, and I believe figures up to April have just been published, but haven't had time to go into them in detail. They do show some growth. Northern Ireland's quarterly exports to the Republic up by £200 million on the quarter compared to the same quarter last year. Imports, so Northern Ireland's imports in the Republic up by 100 million. So in terms of a growth in Northern Ireland economic activity, that would seem to suggest £100 million on the quarter. But there are 3 sort of caveats that apply to all of this. Trade figures are very volatile. When first published, subsequently, they can be revised quite dramatically. We can't be certain that the growth in the trade in both directions will be sustained through the second and third and fourth quarters. I suspect some of it will be, there'll be a ratchet effect. but you can't exclude the possibility that some of it's a temporary adjustment to supply side difficulties, and firms will go back to their, as it were, traditional established suppliers. But I think a third caveat, a very, very important one that is often, I think at the moment is being missed in a lot of commentary about this, is that there's a sense in which this displacement is something of a, could be something of a second best if it represents higher costs and indeed reduces choice to consumers. So there could be a hit to the interests of the businesses and indeed to the welfare of consumers, even though it might look on paper as though some of the trade relationship with GB is being compensated for by a growth with the Republic of Ireland. One final thing I would say about the stats is I've suggested that we need to be careful about the reliability of the data. Another interesting data source is look at the volume of cross-border traffic, number of lorries, in other words, going north-south and south-north. We do have data on that. Again, the Irish Statistics Agency, I think, must have cameras or something at 15 border crossing points, and they count vehicles. Now, this does show growth if you compare April of this year to April of 2019, so pre-COVID. But the growth is around about 5%. Now, admittedly, that's number of vehicles, because it can't obviously tell how much is in them, but that's not as dramatic as an increase as some of the trade value data is indicating. But of course, time will tell. We are in something of a statistical fog at the moment. That has to be readily admitted. But thank you very much. Thanks, Chair. I'll stop at this point.
That's great, Esmond. It's great that you could show up after all the technical problems. It's good that you're here. Anyway, well, thanks very much, Esmond. So that turns us next to Stephen. I don't know, Stephen, if you've got any PowerPoint slides, or are you sticking with the absence of PowerPoint slides so far? Are you going to break the sequence?
I'm going to buck the trend and return to a trend and show some slides, if that's okay. Just because there's a little bit of data that I think is worth showing. Yeah. But I think there's 3 slides or 4 slides or something. So it's not too bad.
Georgina's on the case, I think.
I promise death by PowerPoint won't be imminent.
Thank goodness.
So first off, thank you very much for taking the time to sort of first off for the invitation to speak, and then second off for sticking with this, because I think it's a really important point. It's a really important panel to have, and I would love if we could see more of these into the future, because I do think, as my next slide will attest, we're going to keep coming back to these lessons. So my first point actually comes from something. It's a story I tell many people, which is the day after the referendum. I tried to explain that the UK was leaving the European Union, and my then 8-year-old daughter said, "How can a giant island leave?" And I said, "Well, it can't." And then she said, "What do you mean?" And then I understood that she was way wiser than I was. And in addition to my daughter being much wiser than me, the Swiss ambassador was wise as well. When visiting Northern Ireland, said, "Brexit is forever." I think a play on words being, the famous French phrase, "the provisional is forever." I do think you combine these two statements and you have something quite fundamental, which is that Brexit is a bit like a divorce, where you both agree to share the same apartment. You can't. Brexit is forever because the geographical reality of these two islands implies that solving partially for the issues that it creates will always be the challenge of policymakers. I was very encouraged in listening to the previous 2 speakers, who both pointed to the need for long-term thinking. You know, we can hark back to a century ago and look at these two islands, look at how things have changed, and look at what's remained the same, you know, and realize that it's very likely we'll be talking about Brexit in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, in some sense, because we will always be working out how to share these islands. Fundamentally, there's nothing controversial in saying that. It's just a fact. And it's been true for the previous centuries. It'll be true for the ones in front. So that's the first lesson, I guess, for me. It's 4 kind of things that Brexit has taught me. That's how I structured this talk. Second lesson is that Brexit is inherently sectoral and spatial. You can't understand Brexit looking at GDP. I think the economists did ourselves a disservice by going to the first set of models that any of us would use to understand what happens when a large country leaves a big trading bloc. We all went to the standard trade models that we learned in graduate school, which essentially look at, you know, forcing changes in GDP using a gravity model. All fine, but fundamentally missing the key sectoral and spatial points, which were later filled in by excellent research and, you know, by people on this call and by speakers on this panel, of course, but by many others. What you're looking at here is household median gross incomes on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, workers in these counties in Ireland in Brexit exposed sectors. And what's very interesting is the countries at the bottom, the counties at the bottom, you know, South Dublin and Fingal, 2 of the richest areas in the country by far, where you know many of our the great and the good live. And then you know you go down the other end, and then you have the border counties of Cavan and Monaghan, and then you know you have everywhere else in between. What struck me about this is that it's very, very unlike the COVID shock, which obviously hit the whole country. It has different instances, but it's a much more uniform shock. This is very much a spatial shock. It's very much a sectoral shock to our economy. So trying to understand it via the lens of national statistics, which is kind of how I would have approached it at the very start, is a mistake. And I think trying to understand into the future without recourse to these kinds of finely grained statistics is probably also a mistake. Second point is that the sectoral structures matter. Martina made the excellent point that SMEs will feel the shock of Brexit far more than large economies, larger businesses. The chart there shows 92% of our firms are SMEs, or very small firms. They're responsible for 26% of all employment, but only 6% of export value. We've got a very, very small number of firms, you know, less than 1%, that are very large, 250 persons and over, 1/3 of all employment and 70% of all our output. You know, these dominate both the share of growth and value add and the share of sectors. Another complicating part of this story is that Ireland is part of an intangible asset boom. It's a gold rush in many respects, as several people have described it. But where the intangibles are located in the production chain is very interesting. It's much more on sales and retail than the origination, if you like, of these intangible assets. And I think that the structural story here for the Republic is very different to the structural story in Northern Ireland, which I think the previous speaker discussed in some detail, and I think correctly so. Understanding where the structures are similar and where they're different is, I think, going to be very, very important going forward. This makes roughly the same point, but pulls it down to wages. If you look at separate out the mean wage, the share of employment, and the share of value added, you have a skewed economy. Again, news to absolutely no one on this call, but I think what's really important to stress about this is that this structural advantage that the Republic's economy has had has carried it through both the austerity and recovery period following the global economic crisis of 2008, and it also carried it through the COVID crisis. And this is what explains the remarkable and statistically, I would imagine, quite fanciful growth rates that we've seen into the future. But it does suggest that the structure matters massively when trying to understand Brexit and its implications for us going forward. I'm always struck by this picture. So this is GDP per person in Northern Ireland and the Republic as a percentage of the UK average GDP per person. You can see over the centuries, they both converge, they both get up towards the top there. The Republic jumps because of its decision in the 70s to sort of become a multinational export hub. But you can see again, the statistical issues probably there at the top in the 2000s, but you can see again, trying to understand the impact of Brexit without understanding the impact of the changes over a century in terms of living standards, it's probably not going to go that well. Fourth of 4 lessons. Brexit will always be about people. It was about people. It was about movement of people. It was about movement of all of these things. What you're looking at here is estimated inward migration to Ireland over sort of a 10, I think it's, what is it, 20-year period. You can see that there's thousands and thousands and thousands of UK migrants coming into Ireland and going out. I would hope, and I would really, really hope that these flows don't change overly over time. I think I really do think that the more that the two or more peoples kind of intermix and interact, the more likely we will be to get better outcomes for everyone. And that brings me back to lesson 1. Brexit is forever. We will be talking about this in the Royal Economic Society in 2030. We'll have better data then. And I look forward to better data and to not wrecking everyone's heads with slides. But I think that's probably where I'll stop. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
That's great, Stephen. That's great. Thanks very much, Stephen. That's great. Well, anyway, I'll move on to Stuart next. I presume you don't have slides, but
I do not, Graham. But thanks very much. I guess I guess it's a privilege to be engaged in this conversation, not least because I'm the only non-economist on the panel, but I come with the added curse of once daring to be a commercial lawyer. So look, I'll try to keep this as brief as I can, because I think it's really valuable that we get into the Q&A, and I think that's where we can offer the most value in the conversation. I think the biggest challenge I think we face as communities living on this island, wherever that may be, at this particular point in time, is ensuring that political stability is preserved, maintained, and protected to meet the demands of the various challenges that have been articulated. I think the most obvious one that has dominated the conversation today is the implementation of the protocol and the outworkings of Brexit. This is something that I lead on locally for the CBI. I see it and how it applies to local firms, to firms in GB, and certainly to a number of our firms who perhaps are looking at it from an FDI perspective. There's no question that at the moment that it's just dominating everything socially, economically, and politically. But just at its very basic level, in trade terms, when you put, and setting aside if we can the political issues, putting fetters on trade with GB, which accounts for 2/3 of what we buy and sell, was always going to be particularly challenging. And it was always going to be particularly challenging in the time frame that was set out. But from our experience, and all the caveats have been well laid out around the data that's available to date, and all that comes with that. But our experience to date is that trade has moved reasonably well. The issues around shelves being stacked, empty shelves at the start of the year, there's a spectrum of views on that. I think if you speak directly to the retailers, a lot of the time it was a very deliberate decision because of the limited time frame that they had to prepare. Supermarkets have around 40,000 to 50,000 products at any one time on their shelves, and it was very much an issue of choice, where we had maybe 200 to 300 products discontinued for a limited period of time at the beginning of the year, and we've seen that progress through time. So as I said, trade is moving reasonably well. What I would say, however, is that we are very conscious of the fact that that is down to the grace periods, whether they be mutually agreed or unilateral at this particular point. We're very conscious of that. I think the discussion around the 30th of June and that particular cliff edge, if I may call it that, is slightly misplaced. I think the focus of our attention should be on the grace period that has been unilaterally extended in relation to certifications, and also the grace period in respect of medicines at the end of this year. And I think they're particularly the hearts and minds issues that we need to look at. I think from a CBI perspective, and certainly from a collective business representative organisation perspective, we accepted the protocol. It wasn't perfect, but we recognised it was a political compromise with economic consequences. But we were prepared to work with it because it was a framework, and it was a dynamic framework that was supposed to evolve over time. But I think the question for us and how we kind of strive to make it work, and it's a two-part question, and I think it's one that would be really useful that we as a panel look at and we examine. Is the first part is how do we make it as invisible to the consumer as possible around those hearts and minds issues, around issues like SPS and medicines? How do we make the protocol disappear from everyday life, as it were, insofar as we can within the framework that's been provided? The second question is, and I think it's one that is finding its way into conversation, but is one that has yet been fully, if I'm honest, I don't think has been fully thought through and considered, is whenever the protocol is fully implemented, and whenever we see it evolve in a particular way, can it drive an economic advantage for Northern Ireland PLC to create jobs and prosperity? There's certainly the political discussion around that, but where does the economic debate lie in relation to that? I also think we need to look at it in a much more holistic way when we're looking at it from an all-island perspective. One of the things that I've been focusing on is the issue of services and services across the all-island economy. I think what we would like to see is a rerun of the joint mapping exercise. You saw the joint mapping exercise that was published in June 2019 that identified a number of cross-cutting issues for the all-island economy. I think it's really important to emphasise that this is an area that's protected under the Good Friday Agreement, and likewise is protected under the protocol. But cross-cutting issues such as the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, judicial cooperation on civil matters, where are we left now after the TCA, and in our own engagement with the Commission and with Cabinet Office? It's been a question that we've been raising. What is going to be done in relation to that backbang exercise? Will it be refreshed, and what will the outcome potentially be? And just to touch on one of those issues, looking at professional qualifications, it's an issue that the Department of Economy locally had looked at, and particularly around the functioning of the common travel area. When they looked at it and looked at the functioning of the common travel area, which reflects an intention to support the recognition of professional qualifications around the right to work, when they looked at this and carried out the research into it, what they concluded from that is, if the CTA is functioning as intended, that non-tariff barriers for services between north and south would be reduced by around 50%. And I think these are the discussions that we're maybe not having, that again we need to elevate into the debate. But in terms of just maybe to conclude on the protocol as it stands, and very conscious of questions around its sustainability, we believe it can, subject to political will. But I guess if I was to put it into three baskets, how do we see it working out, and how do we see it being sustained? I think the first one is, I'd say the first point to make is we need to build on the governance structures that are in place at the moment. I think they're particularly light, and I think there's a particular role for civic society and for the business community to play in those governance structures as well, and that link between Brussels and Belfast to be built upon and to be developed out, particularly around the dynamic alignment piece. Secondly, I think we need to reduce the red tape. Looking at the flexibilities, I'm not clear whether an audit was ever carried out on what flexibilities are actually available within the customs code and within the regulatory framework, but can that in addition be built upon through the notion of a veterinary agreement? And then finally, looking at pragmatic solutions, looking at those solutions like trusted trader scheme, or taking an outcomes-based approach whenever it comes to hearts and minds issues like medicines. I'll maybe leave it there because I appreciate that we want to engage in some dialogue and discussion around it, but very much looking forward to the discussion as it develops.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you. So we've had a number of questions in the Q&A function, and please, I encourage people to put their questions into the Q&A function. So I'll start with, if I don't mind, the first question I got was actually directed to Martina, but we'll pass the question around, okay, after Martina. The question is, Martina, do you think the trade agreement that was agreed was negotiated without thinking about the exact nature of the trade between the UK, Northern Ireland and Ireland? And that's from Carol Proper there. So what's your
Right, thanks, Carol, for the question. I think a lot of this sort of specific structure, and Stephen kind of, and Esmond pointed to this as well, of the type of integrated trade that exists, particularly in the retail sector between Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the rest of Great Britain, wasn't, I won't say it wasn't thought about, but it maybe wasn't sort of top of the agenda. The fact that so much of the trade is coming with smaller traders or supermarkets that are doing a lot of these issues are coming about because things like certifications and things like health certs, SPS checks are done on this per consignment basis. And that's fine if you're taking an entire like shipload of frozen lamb from New Zealand, but it doesn't really work for, Marks and Spencer or whoever taking a truckload with perhaps hundreds of different products. And that affects, both trade between Ireland and the UK and Northern Ireland. And I think that structure of lots of small transactions is where the kind of the impact of Brexit has really been hit. And I don't think that level of integration and that sort of structure, that distribution of trade was really kind of thought about in detail in terms of where exactly the implications of Brexit would bind. As Stephen said, maybe there was too much focus on kind of the macro model impacts and not so much on how they will be distributed across different types of firms and different sectors.
That's great, thanks. Now, any other of the panelists want to add anything to Martina's comments? Yeah, Stuart.
Yeah, maybe just come in on that. I think, from our perspective, we were a little surprised by the sequencing of events in December. I think what we expected to see was the TCA agreed first, and then the agreement on the implementation to follow thereafter, and really it being an exercise of filling in the blanks, as it were, as to where maybe there were where the gaps had developed. I think also the approach to it was key to understand that the implementation of the protocol was very much treated by the EU as a separate work stream. So you had the implementation of the protocol as part of the withdrawal process, and as a separate work stream, the withdrawal agreement was brought forward. I think if they were more integrated throughout the process, I think we would have seen perhaps a stronger outcome that would have taken account of the impact across the islands. But I think the process itself maybe perhaps didn't lend itself particularly well to that being front and center of the discussion.
Thanks, Stuart. I don't know if Esmond or Stephen has got anything to add to that, or
no, I agree with both Martina and Stuart. I don't think the NI ROI ROIGB aspect was was really considered there at all. And we all know trade negotiations represent haggling and the impact politically of interest groups. And it's possible, though you couldn't prove this, that the whole question of fishing, and fishing is an important sector, it's an important sector here in Northern Ireland, of course, exercised the politicians in the final week in December much more than the, as it were, the Irish GB, Northern Irish aspects.
Thanks, Esmond. I don't know, Stephen, you got anything?
Very little to add, except just to say that we had previously effectively operated as a single labor market for, you know, north of a century in the Republic's terms, and longer even again when you remove that. The fact that we avoided a situation, you know, COVID accepted, we avoided a situation where, you know, someone from the UK working in the Republic would require some kind of certification, visa process or whatever to do that, and vice versa. And then somebody from the north wouldn't need a visa to work in the Republic. And, you know, but I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that at the very start of this process in 2016, that was an absolute possibility. That was something that could have happened. It was, you know, I go back to what Martina started with, you know, like we are talking now about a trade agreement, you know, and the workings out of it. We're talking about, you know, plus or minus different issues. I'm not a Dr. Pangloss here. I'm not saying everything's fantastic. It's not, but we shouldn't, I guess, we shouldn't imagine that we're in the absolute worst scenario. We're really not. There's a lot of sort of positive stuff that one can and should build on, you know, and that's why, you know, discussions about, you know, tearing it up or ignoring it and this kind of stuff. I just, or even on the other side, you know, let's have a border poll. Like I don't think either sort of poll really helps move us forward in terms of the very important point that Esmond made, which is about like what makes people's living standards better. You know, like what are the arrangements, political, economic, institutional, that actually just make the average person's experience of life a bit better, and moving backwards from that, if that's the outcome we want, and then just moving backwards from that. Like, for example, if it actually turned out that the total deadweight cost was £1 billion, you know, that's 725 plus or minus 30%, right? You know, actually, that's not that much. We could probably, you know, suck that up and move on. Now, but £1 billion every year in perpetuity, you know, it's a bit different. So I keep getting accused of being a centrist dad, and I understand that's a centrist dad point, but I do feel that it's worth making.
Thanks, Stephen. The next question we've got from Maureen O'Reilly. Hi, Maureen. Any views on new UK immigration policy and implications for jobs, skills competition between the two Irelands going forward? I don't know if anybody wants to have first stab at that, or nobody at all. Anybody have any views? Esmond, are you angling towards there answering that?
The UK policy, I think, to some extent has still been worked through in terms of to what extent it's a point system and or something like that, and de facto, and what sort of values are put on bringing in certain types of labour that are defined as absent or lack of supply. Northern Ireland does have some particular labour supply issues, which in a sense is ironic given that we've got a massive level of economic inactivity. The official unemployment stats are not bad. In fact, they're better in recent years than the UK average. Indeed, they were published again today for the most recent months. So I think there's something of a policy dilemma here. On on the one hand, I quite understand that businesses are getting very anxious in Northern Ireland about whether they can recruit the types of specialist labour that hitherto they did get from the EU. And I take Stephen's point about the common travel area. So in a sense, it's still relatively easy for labour to move from south to north within the island. But on the other hand, from the policymakers' point of view, I think there should be more efforts to tap the existing several hundred thousands in the pool of economic inactivity.
Thanks, Esmond. Anybody else want to comment on that question, or shall I go on to the next one? I'll take that as an indicator. I'll go on to the next question. Or
Sorry, I will just come in on that and probably add to what Esmond has said, which is there is a kind of a much broader than Brexit kind of skills question in Northern Ireland, and particularly in terms of school leaving age and school attainment. And there's kind of quite a policy, perhaps kind of objective to be done in kind of attracting back Northern Ireland students who study abroad. And Northern Ireland has, I think, something of a sort of a brain drain where a lot of people leave to go to university in the rest of the UK. And Ireland had a lot of that in the 1980s and 90s. And the director of the SRI, Helen Barrett, has looked a lot at how much returning migrants added to skills and to kind of high skilled employment when they returned in the later 2000s. So there's a kind of a much broader, I'm not an expert on it at all, question of kind of Northern Ireland skills attainment and kind of the attraction of returning migrants. And then there's obviously the issues of kind of how exactly the UK's broad immigration structure is developed will have implications for Northern Ireland, and particularly if it's any sort of salary-based level, could cause problems for one of the areas with kind of relatively lower elements or wages compared to the rest of the UK. So that's going to be a big element going forward in that regard.
That's great, Martina, thanks. So shall I go on to the next question here? Okay. So the next question from Arham Nahar. Apologies if I've mispronounced that name. Will we see an exodus of firms to Northern Ireland, considering UK regulations are much more lenient when compared to EU? If so, how will it impact the long-term potential of Northern Ireland? So there's a lot of assumptions in that question. Does anybody want to go first on that? Maybe use the raise hand function if somebody wants to go first on that question. There's nobody interested in that question.
Well, Graham, I think there is some data, but it's limited for the financial services sector. And of course, because it's services and financial services, it is one of the areas that didn't really get treated and covered to any great extent in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement back in December last year. There's some evidence of relocation out of the City of London to the EU27, although the numbers aren't huge. So I would suggest that the answer to the question is there won't be a large-scale exodus in manufacturing and broadening the point to other sectors. Thanks.
That's great. Sorry, Martina, you were hovering down, sir.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, indeed. Obviously, I think I try to touch on this a little bit, which is that there is potential, I think, positive long-term opportunities for Northern Ireland in terms of the access to both markets. I don't think it comes around because of different levels of regulatory standards. I think if firms in the UK want to export into the EU, they will make their goods to EU standards, regardless of whether or not the UK lowers the standards. And that happens in other countries. There's lots of firms in China making goods to EU standards because they want to sell into the EU. It's not necessarily that every firm is going to try and go down to the lowest common denominator. But it's a big decision for firms to make to kind of move lock, stock and barrel their whole kind of production structure. So I would say it's not so much an exodus that's likely to happen, but maybe that new investments that firms are making on new plants, and that's maybe most in the UK, and foreign direct investment coming into Ireland and the UK, that there's an opportunity for Northern Ireland. But I think that would be a kind of like a slow, gradual, as there are new investments being made and you're deciding where to locate them, rather than a huge move of existing firms into Northern Ireland.
That's great. Sorry, I think Stuart, you've got something to add.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Look, I think just this isn't something that we're seeing, and as you said, like the question is predicated on a number of assumptions, and I think time will tell where things go in terms of regulatory divergence between both markets. A couple of issues, maybe just to flag. I am aware of a number of FDI opportunities where firms from GB or from the States have looked at NI as a potential bridge between both markets, as it were. Although I am also aware of, and again, to come back to the issues I raised, to give you an example, anecdotally, I'm aware of a GB manufacturer who looked at Northern Ireland for those purposes, and very seriously considered setting up, but chose not to set up in Northern Ireland for the simple reason of the political instability that was that had been at play, and certainly the perception of that. So I think that is the question that we have to address in the first instance. And I think the sequencing of events for the protocol and how they're worked through are really, really important. I think at this moment in time, our focus has to be on addressing those hearts and minds issues, as I mentioned. And then I think through time, when we understand what the implementation will look like, will we understand what the opportunities might actually be in some of their parts. The other issue I'd flag is just in terms of what the protocol does with the democratic consent mechanism. I am aware of some members locally who've looked at this and said, if I'm going to make an investment, I'm not going to see a return on that investment for 10 years. So why would I make that if this is going to be subject to consent on a rolling 4-year basis? So I think in terms of where we go, a lot of that will hinge on the direction of travel with the next assembly election, and I think we can be in a much stronger position to address that question from that point on.
That's great, Stuart. Thanks. We have loads and loads of questions, but we've only 5 minutes left. So rather than try and set the land speed record for the political economy of the two Irelands, which I don't think is a record that is a pretty good record to try and do, is what I think I'll do is I'll go around each of the panelists in turn and let them just sum up what they've learned or what their views are or what their key message takeaway points are for the audience, and then I'll wrap up. So I think we'll start with Martina. Would you like to just give a very brief sort of summing up of of your views?
Okay, thanks very much to everybody. That was a great set of comments and questions, and really good to hear from the other panelists. I think that kind of two things that we will dominate coming over probably the next couple of years in this, in terms of how it all works, is we don't yet know how much of the disruption in the kind of the first few months was just learning costs, and that just like these were new procedures. It takes a little bit of time to understand them, but this was all basically temporary, and once firms kind of understand what they're doing, they're backed out, versus how much of it is actually there's been a permanent, and Esmond pointed to this in terms of costs, how much of those are permanent costs that firms will have to take into account on kind of all of their decisions on what to trade and who to trade with, and how that impacts then on, as I said, the distributional issue, which is where I kind of particularly interested on, how much of this just squeezes out the smaller exporters and so on. And so there's still a lot of uncertainty about that. And I think this uncertainty again links into Stuart says in terms of how Northern Ireland can attract kind of investment and growth. And there are some opportunities there, but there's still an aura of kind of uncertainty about how exactly the protocol will be implemented. And I think for a lot of people, it will need to kind of bed down a little bit first before firms would be willing to kind of take the longer term perspective on that. Thanks very much.
That's great, Martina. Thank you. Esmond, if you would like to just come up.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. So clearly, the two economies, North and South, for the future, that they have to become more outward orientated. Both the North and the Republic need to be more competitive. Sometimes there is scope for collaboration between the two economies, North and South, but sometimes it's got to be recognized that we are competing, and that will continue to be the case. So as it were, ultimately the political question is to correctly judge the balance between competition and collaboration. Thanks.
Thanks, Esmond. Stephen, you next.
Look, just thank you everyone for taking the time to listen, and thank you to everyone who's commented. I guess I'd frame my concluding thoughts in two ways. The first is when I'm not a Brexiteer by any stretch of the imagination, but they did make a very valid point, which is that people, households, firms, and governments are very adaptable. Shocks happen, people adapt, everyone moves on. In that sense, if the final form of Brexit is the one that we have experienced, plus or minus some epsilon, we will adapt. However, we've managed to get almost over an hour in without somebody mentioning the C word, so I'm going to now mention it. COVID has changed a lot of that, and some of what it's changed is we are going to see a transition to a bigger state. The base of public spending that COVID has built it's just added to the base of public spending, particularly with health expenditures. Dealing with that is going to be massive for Great Britain and for the Republic. Demographics, they're shifting against both nations, Ireland more forcefully than the UK, and Northern Ireland again more forcefully. Structural shifts. We are going to move to a decarbonised economy in the next 10 to 20 years, or we're all going to be underwater. So we're going to move to a decarbonised economy. There's no sense, I don't think, that this is a policy priority. Add in the fact that both economies, North and South, have housing crises of one kind or another. And you do have the basis for a sustained amount of cooperation, particularly on things like skills. I agree with Esmond, you're going to end up competing on certain things, but it does make sense to cooperate, and particularly in the generation of future focused skills. I think, seeing something like an all-Ireland university or something like that makes a lot of sense to me, simply because we all know that we need to increase the supply of highly trained workers into both economies. But that said, there's always the future, and we've been at this for a century. Let's give it another century and see how we get on. So thank you very much for your time.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. And Stuart, last and not least, your sort of summing up thoughts.
Thanks very much, Graham, and thanks for the discussion. I found it really useful and certainly enlightening. A few things for me certainly to take away and to think about. I think there was more than the one scene not really delved upon, which is we mentioned is really going to shape our future, and it is climate change, and what our future is going to look like, and what it's going to look like in absence of a common regulatory framework on the island. And these are questions that perhaps we didn't get to address. I think just touching on Esmond's point, and I think it's a really important one, just around the notion of Northern Ireland's place either within the UK internal market, or how it sits on the edge of the single market. I think over the course of the next year, and I think conversations like this are important, I think we'll find the answer to the question as to whether we really will see Northern Ireland and whether its place is in gaining that best of both worlds discussion that we have, or whether we're on the periphery of both. So I think I'll maybe just leave it there, and I think that it does merit a lot of further conversation, but thank you for this afternoon, and look forward to further engagement. Thank you.
That's great, Stuart. Thank you very much for coming and participating. So all it leaves for me is to do some sort of housekeeping things. So I think Georgina's got slides regarding a survey for this event that she's going to put up at some point, but while she's doing that, just a number of points for me to close with. again, thank the Irish Economic Association for the support, contribution. In terms of the Royal Economic Society, again, thank you very much to Carol and all for putting on the event. Again, my colleagues at Queen's, again, thank for their support. I've got to, of course, without shadow of a doubt, got to thank the 4 speakers for their participation. And most of all, thank you for the patience of people. We've still got 68 participants here. It says my wee ticker. And that's no mean feat at 5:45 when we've got European football championships on and competing against lots of other things, but it just goes to show economists have their priorities right. But without further ado, that's great. Well, thank you very much for everybody attending. We've had so many more questions. I apologize we couldn't get through them all, but thank you very much for coming.